The Ottoman Empire's succession tradition evolved from the brutal necessity of fratricide to the psychological horror of the cage. For centuries, the empire operated under a ruthless logic where every new sultan secured his absolute throne. He was forced to execute his own brothers to prevent the inevitable chaos of a bloody civil war. However, as the moral weight of these cold executions grew, Sultan Ahmed I introduced a chilling new alternative. He refused to kill his own brother, choosing instead to confine him to a gilded prison within Topkapi. This shift transformed the Ottoman succession into a high-stakes psychological experiment that would haunt the dynasty for ages. Princes were stripped of their agency, denied any formal education, and kept in a state of perpetual fear. They lived in the shadow of execution, effectively severing their every connection to the vibrant world outside walls. This period marked the beginning of a systemic rot, as the men destined to lead were systematically broken. Years of profound loneliness and sensory deprivation eroded their spirits while they waited in the dark, silent chambers. The constant, suffocating shadow of their own impending deaths loomed over them like a heavy, inescapable velvet shroud. They were heirs to a vast empire, yet they remained trapped within the confines of a golden, silent tomb. Each day was a repetition of the last, marked only by the shifting light filtering through the high windows. The guards stood like statues, their faces devoid of emotion, serving as the only link to the living world. The princes grew pale and gaunt, their minds wandering through the corridors of memories they could no longer verify. They whispered to the walls, seeking comfort in the stone that held them captive within the palace's deep heart. The outside world continued its march, oblivious to the ghosts residing in the gilded rooms of the imperial palace. Ahmed I believed he had found mercy, yet he had merely traded one form of cruelty for another path. The cage became a place where time lost all meaning, and the concept of sovereignty became a cruel joke. These men were groomed for power, yet they were denied the very tools required to wield that power effectively. They watched the seasons change through narrow slits, dreaming of the freedom that lay just beyond their heavy doors. Their existence was a paradox, trapped in luxury while suffering the slow, agonizing death of their own human potential. The empire, once a beacon of strength, began to falter under the weight of this strange, new, internal burden. Every prince was a potential sultan, yet every prince was also a prisoner of his own royal bloodline's fate. The silence of the cage was louder than the screams of the past, echoing through the halls of history. They were kings in waiting, but they were also the first victims of a system designed to preserve order. The cost of this order was the sanity of the men who would one day rule the vast empire. Loneliness became their only companion, a constant presence that gnawed at the edges of their fragile, fraying mental states. They were denied the touch of friends, the warmth of family, and the wisdom of teachers and learned scholars. The cage was not merely a room. It was a mechanism of destruction that hollowed out the imperial soul. As the years passed, the princes became shadows, their identities dissolving into the dust of the gilded, empty rooms. They were the forgotten sons of a dynasty that valued stability over the humanity of its own royal blood. The palace walls held secrets that would never be told, buried deep within the hearts of the broken princes. They waited for a call that might never come, or for the blade that might end their long, lonely suffering. The transition from fratricide to the cage was a shift from physical violence to a slow, psychological, and systemic. It was a transformation that would eventually lead the entire Ottoman Empire toward its inevitable and tragic, slow decline. The princes were the casualties of a peace that was bought with the currency of their own shattered minds. They were the gilded prisoners of a sovereignty that demanded everything and offered nothing but a slow, quiet death. The air in the cage was stale, heavy with the scent of incense and the weight of lost, forgotten dreams. Every movement was watched, every word was recorded, and every thought was a potential threat to the reigning sultan. They lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the hand of fate to either crown them or kill. The cage was a testament to the fear that gripped the heart of the empire, a fear of its own. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control, but it ultimately ensured the erosion of the very power it sought. The princes were the living symbols of a dynasty that had lost its way, trapped in a cycle of fear. They were the architects of their own demise, or rather, the victims of an architecture designed to keep them small. The gilded bars were beautiful, yet they were just as effective as iron chains in restricting the human spirit's growth. The princes learned to fear the light, for the light meant the possibility of change, and change was often fatal. They retreated into their own minds, building fortresses of thought to protect themselves from the reality of their confinement. The cage was a mirror, reflecting the insecurities of the sultans who built it, a monument to their own paranoia. It was a place where the past was preserved in amber, while the future was slowly strangled by the present. The princes were the silent witnesses to the decline of an empire that once spanned continents and shaped the world. They were the ghosts of a future that would never arrive, trapped in a present that lasted for many years. The cage was a crucible, and the men who emerged from it were often changed beyond any hope of recovery. They were the products of a system that valued the throne above the man, the crown above the human soul. The legacy of the cage would haunt the Ottoman dynasty until its final, bitter end in the 20th century's light. It was a story of power, of fear, and of the terrible price that is paid for absolute, unchecked, royal. The princes were the ultimate sacrifice, offered up on the altar of a sovereignty that had lost its true purpose. Their lives were the price of the peace that the empire so desperately sought to maintain through the long centuries. The cage remains a haunting reminder of how the pursuit of order can lead to the destruction of the institution. It was the gilded cage of sovereignty, where the light of the empire slowly flickered and eventually faded away forever. The consequences of this isolation were catastrophic, turning the cage into a dark, suffocating crucible. It was a chamber that often produced unstable rulers, ill-equipped for the weight of empire. Men like Ibrahim the Mad emerged from decades of confinement, completely detached from objective reality. His mind, fractured by silence and shadows, led to erratic, violent reigns that destabilized everything. The empire began to crumble from within, poisoned by the madness of its own leaders. While rare exceptions like the transition of Suleiman the Magnificent suggested the system might function, the long-term impact was a hollowed-out monarchy, stripped of its former glory and strategic depth. The cage became a grim metaphor for the inevitable decline of the once mighty Ottoman dynasty. The lack of political experience and mental resilience among the sultans accelerated the empire's collapse. Generations of princes sat in darkness, their potential withered by the absence of true leadership. They were kings in name only, prisoners of a tradition that demanded nothing but compliance. By the time the last sultan fled in a British ambulance in 1922, history spoke. The legacy of the cage remained a haunting testament to the true cost of power. What began as a desperate attempt to preserve order ultimately ensured the institution's total destruction. The walls of Topkapi Palace, once symbols of strength, became the tomb of a dynasty. The silence of the cage echoed through the centuries, a reminder of lost human potential. Every corridor held the ghosts of men who never saw the sun of their own. The empire, once a beacon of expansion, turned inward to consume its own royal blood. Each sultan, broken by isolation, brought the state closer to its inevitable, tragic final end. The gilded bars were not meant to protect the throne, but to imprison the soul. As the world moved toward modernity, the Ottoman state remained trapped in medieval psychological horror. The rot was systemic, reaching into the very heart of the imperial, administrative, and military. Decisions were made by men who had never walked the streets of their own capital. They viewed the world through the narrow slits of their prison, distorted and deeply fearful. The bureaucracy grew corrupt, feeding on the weakness of the isolated, fragile, and broken sultans. No reform could undo the damage inflicted by years of sensory deprivation and constant dread. The dynasty had become a relic, preserved in a jar of its own bitter making. When the end finally arrived, it was not with a roar, but a quiet departure. The ambulance carried away the last of the line, leaving behind a hollowed, empty shell. History records the fall, but the cage remains the true architect of the empire's ruin. The experiment failed, proving that absolute power requires a mind tempered by the real world. Without the touch of reality, the crown became a weight that crushed the wearer's spirit. The Ottoman legacy is forever stained by the choice to trade blood for mental decay. It is a cautionary tale of how fear can dismantle even the most powerful empires. The cage stands as a monument to the folly of men who played at godhood. Their isolation was the catalyst that turned a golden age into a long, slow shadow. The people suffered, the borders receded, and the palace remained a site of profound grief. Each prince was a tragedy waiting to happen, a life wasted in the name of stability was the goal, yet chaos was the harvest reaped by every successive broken sultan. The transition of power became a farce, a hollow ritual performed by the truly lost. The empire had no choice but to collapse under the weight of its own history. The cage was the final, irreversible mistake of a dynasty that forgot how to live. In the end, the walls of the palace could not hold back the tide of time. The world changed, but the sultans remained locked in their private, dark, and lonely hell. Their reign was a flicker in the dark, extinguished by the weight of the cage. The story of the Ottoman decline is written in the silence of those gilded rooms. It is a narrative of lost potential and the crushing burden of a royal title. The cage was not a sanctuary, but a slow-motion execution of the imperial spirit itself. Every sultan who entered the cage left a part of his humanity behind forevermore. The empire paid the price for this cruelty, with its very existence and future survival. The final flight of the sultan marked the conclusion of a centuries-long, tragic, dark experiment. The cage remains a symbol of how fear can destroy the foundations of any state. The legacy of the Ottomans is a lesson in the dangers of absolute, unchecked power. Their story ends in the dust of history, leaving only the memory of the cage. The gilded bars are gone, but the lesson of the broken kings still lingers today. Power must be tempered by wisdom, or it will eventually consume those who hold it. The cage serves as a reminder that isolation is the enemy of all true leadership. The Ottoman Empire fell not to external enemies, but to the rot of its heart. The cage was the silent witness to the slow, agonizing death of a great dynasty. Thus, the gilded cage of sovereignty closed its doors on the final Ottoman sultan forever.